Your structure might be the reason that your business isn't scaling the way it should. As a business leader, you're probably feeling like you're doing everything as best as you can, working hard, making decisions, driving growth. But what if how you are fundamentally organized is actually the bottleneck? The more a business grows, the more you can find yourself trapped in the day-to-day grind. It's frustrating, exhausting, and the stress keeps piling up. So how do you break free and scale without getting stuck? Well, in today's episode, we're joined by Will Farnell, the founder of Farnell Clarke, one of the first accountancy firms in the UK to fully embrace cloud accounting. And then he grew his business more than 30% year on year by rethinking how to structure his company. He's written a number of books, including The Human Firm, which I've got a copy of here, in which Will shares his solutions, including using a pod structure, which has allowed his firm to eliminate the bottlenecks and operate more efficiently. So in this episode of De-Stress Your Business, we'll unpack Will's journey, dive into how the pod structure works, and explore how you can apply these lessons to scale your own business. Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury, a serial entrepreneur and founder at AirManual, and I'm joined by Will Farnell. Welcome to the podcast, Will.
Thanks for having me, Alexis. Really good to be here.
What was the moment that you realized that the way that the business was structured might actually be holding you back?
So for the first kind of history of it, I founded the business in 2007 and made many of the mistakes that so many entrepreneurs make in those early years. Lots of short-term decisions, thinking that, hey, growth is going to slow down. And in the book you kindly mentioned there, The Human Firm, I talk about various points of an organization's growth where we hit hurdles, we hit barriers in the road that cause us to stop and have to rethink what we're doing. And the obvious first one of those is when you take on your first employee. But moving on from that and talking to many particular accounting firm owners who I spend a lot of my time talking to, any that have gone through high growth have kind of reinforced these points of challenge. And for me and for many others, it's at 8 people, it's at 15 people, it's at 23, 35, 50, 70, 100. And I think the start point was at the first one of those hurdles when it was all about structure. Now we're in professional services, and the way that many accounting firms structure themselves is in service lines. So you'll have somebody that is responsible for payroll, and somebody who's responsible for VAT, and somebody for year-end accounts, somebody for personal tax. And we did what everybody else before us did and said, well, that's obviously got to be the way to do it because that's the way everybody else does it. And we tried to do that. But the challenge is that clients don't always know. We make assumptions about what clients might or might not know. And we think, well, of course they can know the difference between VAT and accounts and personal tax. But actually what they want to do is speak to somebody who they know as quickly as they can without thinking about, well, what's my question in relation to? So we tried this service line route and it didn't work. And then we said, well, okay, let's go for single point of contact. So we'll give everybody a dedicated person to talk to. And our mistake there is that we pitched it too low. So we pitched it too junior. So what happened is that clients would call and the person they spoke to perhaps didn't have the experience to be able to answer the question. So it gets referred up the line, or they didn't know how to prioritize and therefore kind of responded to those that shouted loudest and missed the stuff that was really critical. So that didn't work either. So we said, well, okay, let's raise the bar and let's make that single point of contact somebody with a bit more experience. But then we ended up with too many chiefs and not enough Indians. So for a process of trial and error, we got to a point where single point of contact was the right solution, but we needed to structure it in a way that would work. And that was the start of what I came to refer to as pods, where we would structure small teams within a team. And there's a risk here that somebody challenged, yeah, but aren't you creating silos? That's about how you structure the wider business to make sure you don't get that silo mentality. But our focus as an accounting firm has always been on how do we deliver the best possible experience for clients. So if we start from the point of the view of what's important to the client, it's they need to know who understands what's going on in their business. So the pod structures enabled us to create that dedicated point of contact, provide that client manager in the sense of how we positioned it, with the resource underneath them to be able to deliver for the client. But actually, the key bit was that I was the bottleneck. So up until the point that we did that, and I was prepared to let go of control, because the other thing with many accountants is we're control freaks, whether we admit it or not. And we always think that we're going to do it better than anybody else. So that's like the first challenge in this, is you've got to be prepared to let stuff go and let somebody else take ownership of that. But what we saw in developing this pod structure, and our business has grown at, or on average grown at about 30% year on year every year for the best part of 15 years. The one thing that this structure has enabled us to do is scale efficiently, because again, accounting firms tend to operate with client portfolios, generally led by a partner. So the way you scale an accounting firm is bring in new equity partners. And I always knew that wasn't the model that I wanted, because I wanted a corporate model, and we needed to be able to bring people in that could manage those portfolios, but didn't necessarily need to have an equity stake in the business. So the pods gave us the ability to be able to scale, because it wasn't dependent on me as the principal. It was also the fact that it created great career clarity for members of the team, because they could see that we'll create another pod. And that means we need a new client manager, we need a new senior, we need new trainees in each of those pods. So we're starting to create an opportunity for our teams to see what their career opportunities look like as well.
Really, really nice. And I think it's such a brilliant model for, as you say, for that scale, because it becomes really clear to see, okay, we can just add additional pods to the side of this as we grow, to help people kind of really visualize what that looks like. Can we go into a bit of the detail around typically the size of a pod? What does that mean in terms of operationally? How do people react to, who are people working with? What are some of the roles within it? And we'll start there, and then I'll dive in even deeper.
So again, from an accounting point of view, and this is absolutely translatable, certainly to any professional services business. And I guess in essence, if you've got people that are running creative agencies, I guess it's like project teams. The difference that we have as an accounting business is that our projects last almost forever until we get something wrong and somebody decides that they're going to go elsewhere. That's the beauty of our business model, is we have the single gross recurring fees. That means clients come back and pay us every year as long as we're doing the right things for them. So for us, we found that teams of 4 was the optimum level. So that, in our sense, is a client manager, a senior, and a couple of trainees that are supporting that. Again, because of the nature of our business model, we can look at the cost base, we can look at what the gross margins are we want to deliver, and we know the capacity of that pod in terms of the revenue that they're able to deliver based on the resource cost that we have. And everything is driven by GP margins in what we do. So we know that it doesn't matter almost how many clients sit in each of those pods, it's all about the revenue number. So when the revenue gets to 300,000, 350,000, we know we're at capacity, because as much as we talk about we don't charge on time, our cost base is based on time, because our people have only got so many hours in a week. So there is always a capacity that people get to. So we can start to plan when we might need another pod. And it may be that in the early stages, people listening and saying, well, this sounds a great model, but I've only got 6 people at the moment. Then the obvious thing there is you have 2 pods of 3, and you build new capacity in the pod as a new business comes in. When you get to 2 pods of 4, you might think, right, we've now got to start another pod. So you might end up with 2 pods of 3 and a pod of 2 again, and you build the capacity. But that's the beauty of the model, that it's not set in stone. But what we find is the optimum point, having tried smaller pods, having tried bigger pods, we always come back to the fact that the 4 just works in terms of the communication models around it, how the teams communicate. And I don't know for sure, but somebody once told me that somebody had said that SAS SWAT teams or whatever operate in teams of 4 because it's the optimum communication model. I don't know whether there's any truth in that, but it has been mentioned to me before that the communication dynamics of teams of 4 is really, really effective.
Nice. And I think it's something that I think it's, you started with your answer saying this is something that's applicable to other businesses, because it's something I've seen as a dynamic in other businesses too, that I've either been advisor to or consulting or whatever. Like, for example, there's a training provider that I've done a lot of work with and advised, where that's an example where it's sort of professional services in the sense they're giving training, but it's, in their case, distance learning. It's high volume of courses to many, many employees.
Yeah.
And yet that pod structure is something that I remember us putting in quite a long time ago. And it was because of the nature of needing someone who has some of the knowledge of what's going on, either at the individual client level or in this case, individual learner level, or maybe even at a sort of sector or group. Like it needs
Yes.
some level of specialism. And I think often a lot of organizations historically have been organized through more of a traditional organization structure diagram, perhaps first introduced by Drucker, where it's kind of this diagram of you have a manager and they manage 6 people, and each of those people can manage 6 people, and each of those people can manage 6 people. And of course, here we're talking about something that is much more vertical, really. You've got one person who's the client manager, and reporting to them is basically a senior person who's doing most of the work, and then they've got 1 or 2 people supporting them, and that's a small unit and quite a jump away from that kind of traditional structure. And yet I've seen it appear many places and get really good results. And I think particularly that scalability. One thing that's really interesting you shared early on is getting that level of where the client contact goes into, that single point of contact really matters. Talk to me a bit about the roles in that pod and where that client contact goes in, and therefore what skills and experience is required for each of those roles.
Yeah. So for us, the client manager is the person that owns the client relationship. So they have responsibility for it in the way that in a traditional accountancy partnership, that relationship would have sat with the partner. We've just pushed it down. But what we do, and it's part of the way that we operate, is we empower our junior teams. They have client contact from very early on, because actually, if the client manager is busy, we want the client to know that they can talk to a senior, or they can talk to somebody else, depending on what it is they're trying to do. So our junior staff, our trainees are doing bookkeeping work. So they'll contact the client for missing paperwork. But what we're trying to do is say to a client, you've got a team here that is here to support you. The client manager is ultimately the person that has a responsibility for making sure that everything gets done, the client's happy. Any key technical questions are going to go in at that level, and at that point they may be escalating to a different part of the firm, but that's managed through the relationship the client manager has. So even if we use it's a specialist tax query that goes to another part of the business, it's still managed and owned by the client manager, and the client manager becomes an internal customer almost of the technical specialist elsewhere in the firm.
Nice. And so in terms of the level of experience and their knowledge and their qualifications, typically what have you found that's kind of worked at that level? Because I think that's one of the things that holds a lot of people back, particularly as you say, like in accounting firms, the partner is usually the one that does 90% of the client contact and the client meetings and so on. And as you say, maybe some of the queries are addressed by sort of lower in the organization, but that's going to be one of the first things that they really struggle with is, but I've got those relationships and and you can't teach this kind of stuff and so on. So how do you make sure that those client managers have got the skills, the knowledge, the experiences needed so that they can manage that relationship effectively?
Yeah, it's all about the confidence and the opportunities that are created for those people. So your example there about, I've got the experience and only I can do it, and they haven't got the experience, is because they haven't given them the opportunity to get that experience. So much of this is about actually making a conscious decision that you want to empower your managers to take this responsibility and accept the accountability that comes with it. And to a point, you're taking a risk on this stuff. But actually, it's kind of the way we learn, isn't it? And people want to be able to have an impact. And last thing we want to do is limit people's ability to have impact. So much of it isn't about mindset of what we're prepared to let people do and what we're prepared to let go of. And the whole point is that this was about scale. If we wanted to scale, we had to adopt a different model, because otherwise we need to bring in loads of equity partners, and that's not what we're about. And because we were doing it at pace, it's kind of really easy to grow a business. It's much harder to scale a business. There's a big distinction between those two things, as we learned firsthand on many occasions, because we we were driving growth and weren't always putting the foundations in to scale effectively. And that was the pods was probably one of two things that were most fundamental to our ability to be able to scale.
Mm. Is there a particular occasion where you remember that sort of major bottleneck moment during a growth phase where it felt like that was the crucial thing, and what would have happened if you hadn't have made the change?
I mean, there were many, but we were at a point fairly early on where, I mean, we were taking on a new client every day with a very small team. And that whole kind of onboarding of clients is so critical. You get one opportunity to make a great first impression. And when you're taking on one new client a day, including weekends, it's really easy to drop balls. And you have to get that right. And that was largely because it all relied on me. I was the one that had to do it, and I was still controlling everything. I was still having every conversation with a client, and it was completely unsustainable. So at that point, it's a case of, well, we've got to do something here. We've got to think about the structure. We've got to empower other people to be part of this process. Now, some of that is just natural growth and bringing people in, but we were doing it so fast that it needed something that could adapt and keep pace of what we were doing as a business. How do we get that many people involved in different activities from their normal day job as fast as we can to make sure that clients are getting the level of experience that they deserve?
Nice. And when you first implemented the pods, how did your clients and the team react? Like, were there any tricky bits that you had to deal with there? How did you make sure that they then sort of embraced the change and saw benefits quickly?
It's communication. So making sure that everyone understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how it's going to work. For clients, it was quite easy because they had a relationship with a manager level person anyway, because that was the stepping stone to the pods. It was then down to the client manager to introduce other people that were going to be working on the jobs for the client. And for the team, it was a pretty easy sell because it's about, look, this is what we're doing. We're doing this because we think it's the right thing for clients. So that's the first thing, that everyone in accounting really cares about clients.
Yeah.
So position any change to what's the impact on the client. And again, I'm sure that's not unique just to clients, that people in every area of business kind of genuinely want to make a difference to the clients, customers that they serve. So any change management, if we can hook it on, this is why it's right for our customer, this is why it's right for our client, you're going to win hearts and minds. So making it really clear to our team, we're doing this because it's going to be better for the client. But at the same time, look, we can give you this clear path in terms of, here's 4 levels in our teams. So here's the opportunity for you to move from this one to this one. These are the competencies that you need to demonstrate to us to show that you can do the job at the next level. That creates career progression.
Nice, which I've seen in the accounting industry, particularly where there's a sort of global talent shortage. One of the reasons quoted for why people leave the industry or choose not to go into the industry is that concern around career development. I think partly sort of, not having that clarity as you've described, where actually you are providing that to your team. I think one of the other things I see as a challenge is that the shift in model towards having client managers who can running multiple pods, rather than bringing on people either internally or from externally as partners who then have their own bit, means that there perhaps isn't the same career development opportunity that there previously was. And indeed, it's sort of, I know it's well known in the industry that there's an element of, oh, you work really hard, but then one day you can become partner and then you own a piece of the pie and so on. How's that changed things for your team in terms of that sense of career progression? As you say, it's like, in some ways it's improved things because you're able to give them a competency framework, but on the other hand, you're not pursuing and then we add another partner route.
So I think that part of this is generational shifts as well in terms of expectations. We're seeing huge amounts of private equity interest in the accountancy world at the moment, largely because of the challenge of succession. So one of the key drivers is that we have a generation or generations coming through that are not as inclined to want to make investments into buying into partnerships and things anyway, which is why the doors have been swung open for private equity to come in and solve some of those succession plannings. So I think there's a different expectation people have. I think we can still create career progression opportunities, create remuneration reward packages that drive people to want to do this stuff without necessarily wanting or feeling that they've got to make an investment into becoming an equity partner. So I think that's partly a shift. People want different things from work than they did 30, 40 years ago. So part of this is actually just adapting to a different way of the world. I mean, when we look at the number of people that go into self-employment, it's probably about one in 10. So 90% of the population don't want that anyway, but they want to be paid fairly for the job they do. They want the recognition for doing the things they do well. And we can do that. We can create those opportunities. And what we've done as we've grown is we've created extra layers of leadership within the organization that creates opportunities for people to progress. And when pods are performing well and delivering good margins, then there's opportunities to share in that reward.
Nice. And when you've sort of got, you've got your pods set up, you've got it to a point where clients are working with those managers, you're continuing to add clients, as you say, every day, including weekends. You mentioned before around a sort of rule of thumb, £350,000 worth of revenue per pod. That's when you start to know the right capacity. How did you, what do you tend to look for to know, okay, now it's time to adjust the pod structure or add another pod? And are there particular groupings that you apply to pods, for over a particular technology or a particular sector or a particular size of business?
It creates the opportunity to do that. So in our world, it could be the software that clients are using, whether they're using Xero, Sage, QuickBooks, Free Agent, whatever it might be. It could be sector specialism. So we might have a client manager that deals with lots of e-commerce businesses. So that's a natural home for those kind of businesses. We're a fairly general practice, and we generally tend to use a particular technology stack. So that's less relevant for us, but certainly some of the firms that I've helped put this structure in place have certainly adopted that approach in terms of, well, this can be a hospitality pod and that can be a construction pod, because you then get to build almost those micro niches within the firm where the client can talk to somebody that really understands their sector or really understands the technology that they're using. So it creates those opportunities for us, although it's not essential to go down that route. I mean, we have general pods, and as I said earlier, we know when a pod is full based on the revenue, because that's the nature of our business. But other sectors may have other metrics that will say that pod's at capacity because it's the number of deadlines they've got in a particular time period, for example. So every business will be different, but we can look at the specific metrics that are relevant to our industry and identify where the opportunities are and when we hit capacity, and how far in advance you want to plan for that capacity in creating new pods. How long does it take to get a pod up to speed and ready to run on its own 2 feet?
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's something that I've always loved in building businesses, is where you can identify certain units of simplicity where you can establish a set of metrics and understanding, a set of processes, and say, yeah, when we get to a point that X, hit certain revenue numbers or deadlines or whatever, number of calls, number of demo calls in software world or whatever, basically saying, okay, when we hit that, we know it's at capacity, and therefore this is that kind of unit of growth. I really like. I've got a friend who owns like a loft boarding business, and for him, his growth just absolutely accelerated once he worked out what's that essentially pod structure look like. And so then he knew once he'd got that one working, he could then just replicate that across different locations around the UK. And so went from a business that was doing 100,000 a month, 100,000 a year, to doing 100,000 a month, and then over 13 million a year in really, really quick time, because of that really nice scalable model. One of the challenges I often see businesses struggling with when they create these kind of structures is that balance of giving it autonomy and working as its own team, but also then establishing consistency in terms of consistency of process. And when we've spoken before, I remember one of my favorite quotes from you is, when you don't control the process, you don't control the profit, right? Yeah. And so how do you manage that? How do you make sure that despite this risk of silos, actually you're still able to provide consistency and efficiency across this?
So for us, as we are now, we have people sitting over those pods in our kind of senior leadership team that are driving consistency. So it's making sure that every pod is operating the same way. So client managers are reporting into a director level member of the team, and we make sure that that drives the consistency, standard operating procedure, processes that are clear, flow systems that make sure everybody's following the same process. We have a head of client experience who makes sure that client experience is consistent. So that's the point that I made right at the beginning, that we have to make sure that there is conversation across the various pods to make sure that everyone's actually doing the same thing, and that we don't get mini businesses operating within one business, because that's the risk of it. But having standard operating procedures, making sure that people are following those processes, making sure that somebody is overseeing at a senior level what's going on, and that everybody is clearly focused on the business strategy, the business vision, the business purpose, and everything else ensures that you don't get that silo mentality being created.
Nice. And does that apply, what about to things like recruitment? And because that's an area where classically in a lot of businesses, it's done haphazard differently by different people in different areas, or there's a lot of autonomy given to the person who's, they're going to be working for. When you've got this pod structure, that makes it a little bit more difficult, where you might have multiple client managers fighting for the same, juniors that they think are particularly good. How do you tend to kind of manage that? Is it more you take what you're given and you manage
Pretty much,
them well?
it's a central process, I think, is the correct way of positioning it. So we have a central HR team. It would be in our accounts team, it would be our director of accounts and advisory that would be part of that recruitment process and put people in the right places. Yes, they might bring in a client manager, but generally we don't have a situation where we're recruiting for 3 seniors at the same time, for example, because we're either creating a new pod, and so much of that progression is from internal team members. That's, again, part of the benefit here, that we're creating opportunities for people to move not sideways, but sideways and up. So into another pod, but taking the next step on their career path. So generally we're either then bringing in trainees, or somebody decides they've got a better opportunity somewhere else, and then we're replacing. So we'll go out to market if there isn't somebody internally to step in.
Nice. And so, I can see how, as you said, that central location of recruitment and training and all those sorts of things means that, partly as part of your strategy and growing the business, they're constantly supporting that process of, okay, we're going to need another pod at this point. Therefore, looking at succession planning within the organization, who have we got that might be an appropriate client manager at that point, who's going to be stepping up perhaps from senior that would go into that role, who's going to be going up from junior to senior that might be our senior in this pod, and therefore presumably it becomes more a case of sort of backfilling in a lot of cases, where actually you're taking people in the other pods and filling those gaps by moving people up and then hiring more essentially juniors into the bottom of it, I guess, rather than having to make a lot of senior hires, which has its own benefits as well. That's really nice. You mentioned that you've worked with many other organizations, helping them to implement these sorts of things and grow their businesses. What are some of the resistances or hesitations that you've seen to implementing this structure?
I think often it's lack of understanding, or the challenges of the mix of people at various levels they've got that creates a reluctance, and sometimes takes a bit of effort to say, look, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where your gaps are. But by going through the process and mapping it out, and not just mapping it out today, mapping it out for 12 months' time. And 3 years' time, because if somebody says, okay, I want to grow my business and I want to do, 20% year on year growth for the next 3 years. So what does that look like in terms of what your headcount's going to need to be? What people have you got in the business now, and where might they be in 3 years' time? And map that out, because that will help you understand what recruitment decisions you might want to take now, because whilst yes, you've got an immediate need today, actually what we want to be thinking about is, how long does somebody take to progress, and where do you need people in 24 months' time, in 36 months' time? So when you have a structure that you can start to map and say, well, if we're going to grow 20%, then we need an extra 6 people. Where are those 6 people going to sit? And when you start to map it out in terms of the pods and say, well, this person here isn't a manager yet, but in 3 years they will be.
Mm.
So actually, you don't need a manager because in 3 years' time, you're going to have too many managers. So just being able to do some planning around resource requirement when you have a very clear picture of what that structure looks like, it makes it easier to do that longer term planning.
Yeah, really nice. And one things that I see as one resistance to this model is for those partners who charge significant amounts for their time,
Yeah.
their concern and worry is, well, I won't have as many billable hours if I'm passing that client contact to client managers. Is that something you've seen, and how has that overcome?
It's not, because I tend to be doing it the other way before people have got to that point where they've got a multi-partner, or where there are, I don't know, 2 or 3 partners. They're in a similar position to us in terms of we want to grow, but we don't want more partners. So then it's beginning to think about, well, how do you do this? Do you want to sit over 3 client managers and broaden your portfolio because you're now at capacity? So you can't do any more because you're still reviewing everything. You're still having every client meeting. So it's almost a case of people at that point where they know that they're at capacity and can't continue to grow if they don't make changes. So it's then saying, well, okay, how do we help you start to let go of stuff that you don't need to be doing? And one of the things I say to people regularly is, what are the things that only you can do? And everything else, somebody else should be doing. You should only be doing the things that only you can do. And if you're doing more than that, then you're not being efficient because you're too expensive to be doing those kind of things.
Agreed. I think one of the things that I do see, though, is that when you ask that question, the same list of the things that they're currently doing can often come back. And so often it's helping them understand, okay, tell you what, here's what you should be doing. In your view, when we're talking about a professional services firm, what would you see as being essentially the role of the owners? What would you see as their activities that they should be doing rather than the things that are not only they should do?
Yeah, I mean, it's that old age thing of working on the business, not in the business. So strategy, development, where are you going? What's the vision? What are the values? Making sure people are buying into the values of the business, being the face of the business. That's got to be the focus, because otherwise we get sucked into detail and we never realize the potential that we have if we focus on the right things.
Yeah, agreed. I think one of the other pieces that I often see missed in organizations where there's so much time spent on client contact is also the sort of culture development, the defining and the shaping of the values and making sure that those are kind of embedded and used in the organization to actually create a place that's great to work and in line with how you want to operate. I often see that just becomes sort of organically, in some cases, not that nice in places,
Yeah.
and that can cause problems as well. So I think we're both aligned, and there's plenty to do still as the business owner. You won't be short of stuff to do.
Yeah. You're not going to get
It's
bored.
just it's just high value work,
Mm.
which is cool. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Are there any cases where you've seen this kind of get held up perhaps by client side bottlenecks? Because I know that, particularly if you take something like accounting, often when accountancy firms try to put in changes, they hit the reality of how a client works. Like, for example, trying to get them to submit documents earlier in the year so that you don't have a rush to deadlines. How have you seen that sort of navigated with using this pod structure?
I've genuinely never seen it being an issue, because so much of the challenges that accounting firms talk about having is down to their own mindset and their own ability to make assumptions about what clients will and won't do. And hey, I've been guilty of this as well. So it's like, this is based on my many years of learning and looking at things, all the things that I did, and looking back on them now and saying, why on earth did I do that? And why didn't I do this? And it's a real problem. We're really quick to make assumptions. Whereas, again, you talk to a client, we're doing this because we want to make sure that we can respond to you quicker. We can turn your accounts around quicker, give you the answers to the questions you need quicker, make sure that you've always got somebody to talk to. I mean, there's nothing that a client should be able to say, well, I know I'd rather you take a week to respond to me, and everything else, that's just not going to happen. So all of this is about doing better by the client. So there is no reason for a client to kick up against it. The only thing that's going to stop it happening is you by making assumptions about what a client will and won't do.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's so common in so many changes that we need to make as business leaders in businesses, that we stop short just because we assume too much about the resistance that will be there, and that, oh, that our team won't like this, or that our clients won't like this, or whatever. And I think, as you say, it's all about communication and going back to why are we doing this? Who's it for? What's the benefit it's going to bring? And communicating that nice and early. I think one of the other things you talked about much earlier in the episode, you said that sort of reducing the reliance of the business on you. One of the big things was setting up the pods and the pod structure. You said there was a second thing as well, which I'm going to move on to, because I know in like your first book, in the digital firm, you talked about the process of de-willing, removing will from the business. And in the human firm, you've talked about then de-Francising and so on, for like removing next level out. Like, what was your experience when you were getting stuck in the detail, when you're getting stuck in the business? What did that feel like, and what else aside from pod structure did you put in place to free yourself?
So I think that it was, again, initially it was me feeling I had to do everything, and getting to the point where I had people that I felt I could rely on to pass stuff to. But even then, I mean, I regularly talk about the fact that for some ridiculous reason, I had a team of 23 people and I was still opening a post every day, which was just obscene. But it was, for me, it was still a control bit, that opening the post meant I saw what was going on and I had visibility of what was coming in and going out. But I mean, that we eventually got rid of me. But I think it was the point that when I actually made the decision and we said, okay, Will's got to step back from this, it was actually easier than I ever imagined it would be. But I think that was because we brought James in. So we brought in somebody to do an MD role who didn't have any client-facing responsibility, whose sole job was to run the business. So at that point, I felt, actually, you know what, I don't need to do that. So I can take this step back. And that was the de-willing that we referred to in the first book. But I think, again, it's mindset. We've got to be prepared to let go. The only way we're going to let go is convincing ourselves that it's the right thing to do. And the other thing that I was referring to was actually around clarity of purpose. So the two things that have enabled our business to grow and scale is, I think, pod structures enabled the scalability. Clarity of purpose gave us that direction in terms of, this is constantly what we're striving to do. This is why we're doing what we do. This is the impact that we want to have. And that was the thing that drove it. And clarity around that purpose meant that I couldn't fulfill that purpose if I was still preparing sets of accounts. So it's being clear on, why did you do this in the first place? What was it that you were actually striving to do? What was the change in the world that you wanted to make in setting up your business? And you get to the point where you can't do that if you're stuck in the weeds and you're stuck in the detail, because you then stop growing and you then stop being able to have the impact that you want with more clients, or with more team members, or with more clients, whatever it is that's driving you to do the things that you do.
Fantastic. Love it. Well, I now want to dive into some quick fire questions for you, Will. So one sentence answers, please. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. Let's start with, what one thing causes most stress for you?
It's always cash.
What activity should a business owner never delegate?
Oh, great question. The last thing that I let go of in my business was business development, because nobody could get across the message in the way that I did.
What would you say to a business leader who says there's no way their team can handle client relationships?
Anyone can handle client relationships if you're clear on what it is you want them to do.
Love that. What book or podcast has been most pivotal for you in changing your life for the better?
Oh, wow. Probably E-Myth Revisited.
Nice. By Michael Gerber.
Yes.
Great. And what's the one thing you want business leaders to take from this episode?
Whilst we talked about structure, I think the fundamental thing is clarity of purpose.
Nice. Love it. Fantastic. I really appreciate that, Will. There's lots of great places that people can go learn more from Will. There's your website, willfarnell.com. There's your LinkedIn profile, and I'll put links to these in the show notes. There's also your books, The Human Firm and The Digital Firm. Again, links in the show notes. Any other links or resources that we should reference?
Just the accounting firm, farnellclarke.co.uk, but there's plenty of stuff on the website and my LinkedIn content, so that'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Will. Your insights on this topic are so valuable, and indeed across lots of areas. In fact, as I've referenced, your books have been super useful, and including for me as part of my research into best practices for accountancy firms. I think you know that I've referenced them in a few places as part of a playbook that I've developed on best practice SOPs specifically for accountancy and bookkeeping businesses. So thank you for that. And for anyone listening to this episode or who owns or leads a practice, then please do feel free to email me if you want to get one of those best practice processes. Just email alexis.kingsbury@airmanual.co and let me know what process in your business you'd love to get best practice template for and why. But otherwise, thanks again to Will for joining me. It's been absolutely fantastic. And if you found this episode useful, then please do share it on social media, tag us in. We'd really appreciate it. But otherwise, until next time, have fun.
Thank you.